Big Four Governance, Risk and Compliance, GRC, Interview Prep. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into GRC interview preparation used across Big Four consulting teams. These questions come from real interview patterns across Big Four firms and global capability centers. GRC focuses on how organizations govern decisions, manage enterprise-wide risks, and stay fully compliant with regulatory expectations. Let's begin. How do you assess the maturity of an organization's governance framework during a GRC review? Sample answer. I review board structure, committee charters, decision-making processes, escalation protocols, and documentation quality. I benchmark these against governance standards like COSO, SEBI, or corporate governance codes. I score maturity across clarity, accountability, transparency, and oversight. While answering, always talk about governance pillars, benchmarking, evidence quality, and maturity scoring. A company lacks formalized policies. How do you design a policy governance structure from scratch? Sample answer. I define a policy hierarchy, board policies, management policies, SOPs, and guidelines. I assign owners, approval workflows, review cycles, and documentation templates. Then I create a central repository with version control. While answering, always talk about hierarchy, ownership, approval flow, and lifecycle governance. How do you determine key governance risks while evaluating board and committee effectiveness? Sample answer. I assess board composition, independence, meeting frequency, agenda quality, decision trails, and oversight of strategy, risks, controls, and compliance. I also evaluate how information flows to committees. While answering, always talk about composition, oversight depth, information quality, and decision effectiveness. A client asks you to assess tone at the top. What factors do you evaluate? Sample answer. I look at leadership's communication, ethical conduct, responsiveness to risk, disciplinary actions, and adherence to policies. I check whether leaders model expected behavior. While answering, always talk about leadership behavior, communication, ethical cues, and consistency. How do you align governance practices with regulatory frameworks like SEBI, Companies Act, or SOX? Sample answer. I map each regulatory requirement to current governance practices, disclosures, committee roles, internal controls, reporting frequency, and documentation. I highlight compliance gaps and redesign processes to align with the law. While answering, always talk about mapping, gap analysis, corrective design, and regulatory alignment. A company has decentralized decision-making. How do you evaluate governance consistency across locations? Sample answer. I compare how policies are interpreted across offices, evaluate escalation and approval consistency, review documentation standards, and check if controls vary significantly. While answering, always talk about consistency checks, local deviations, control uniformity, and escalation paths. How do you perform an enterprise-wide GRC gap assessment? Sample answer. I assess governance, risk management, compliance monitoring, internal controls, and reporting quality. I compare against frameworks like COSO and ISO standards and document gaps by severity. While answering, always talk about framework-based assessment, severity rating, prioritization, and mapping. A regulator issues new guidelines. How do you evaluate impact on existing governance and compliance processes? Sample answer. I map new rules to current processes, assess gaps, identify stakeholders impacted, and create an implementation plan, including policy changes, training, and monitoring updates. While answering, always talk about mapping, impact analysis, stakeholder impact, and rollout planning. How do you design and implement an integrated GRC framework for an organization? Sample answer. I integrate governance roles, risk registers, control libraries, and compliance obligations into one framework. Then I define ownership, workflows, escalation rules, and reporting dashboards. While answering, always talk about integration, ownership, workflows, and reporting. A company uses outdated SOPs. How do you assess risks arising from outdated documentation? Sample answer. I check whether process changes are undocumented, identify control gaps, validate if employees follow inconsistent steps, and assess regulatory risks from noncompliance. While answering, always talk about documentation gaps, process divergence, control weakness, and compliance exposure. How do you identify and prioritize compliance obligations across jurisdictions? Sample answer. I build a compliance universe, classify obligations by risk, map them to processes, and assign owners. I prioritize based on regulatory severity and business impact. While answering, always talk about obligation mapping, severity, ownership, and prioritization. A company operates in multiple countries. How do you assess differences in regulatory compliance requirements? Sample answer. I compare laws country by country, identify local deviations, and harmonize policies with controlled exceptions. I also evaluate monitoring maturity in each jurisdiction. While answering, always talk about comparative analysis, controlled exceptions, harmonization, and monitoring. How do you evaluate adequacy of compliance monitoring mechanisms? Sample answer. I review monitoring frequency, testing coverage, reporting quality, issue closure timelines, and independence of reviewers. While answering, always talk about coverage, independence, testing depth, and follow-through. A client receives repeated compliance audit observations. How do you design corrective actions? Sample answer. I categorize recurring issues, test root causes, policy gaps, training gaps, or system limitations, and design actions with owners, timelines, and measurable KPIs. While answering, always talk about root cause, categorization, ownership, and measurable actions. How do you map risks to relevant controls within a GRC tool or framework? Sample answer. I link each risk to one or more preventive and detective controls, define control attributes, and assign owners. I ensure mappings reflect real workflows. While answering, always talk about linkage, control attributes, ownership, and workflow alignment. A business has no defined risk appetite. How do you help them establish one? Sample answer. I conduct leadership workshops, identify tolerance for financial, operational, regulatory, and reputational risks, and translate them into quantitative thresholds and qualitative statements. While answering, always talk about leadership alignment, thresholds, statement drafting, and communication. How do you evaluate risk culture across departments and management layers? Sample answer. I review decision-making behaviors, escalation norms, training records, survey results, and alignment between risk policies and actual practices. While answering, always talk about behavior, escalation, surveys, and practice alignment. A process has repeated exceptions to controls. How do you evaluate compliance risk? Sample answer. I assess frequency, root causes, control design versus execution gaps, and whether exceptions indicate negligence or systemic flaws. While answering, always talk about exception trends, control design, execution gaps, and systemic risk. How do you assess whether risk ownership is clearly defined in the organization? Sample answer. I check whether risks have assigned owners, documented responsibilities, escalation points, and accountability mechanisms. While answering, always talk about ownership clarity, responsibility mapping, escalation, and accountability. A company is adopting a new GRC software. How do you validate whether it fits their needs? Sample answer. I define functional requirements, risk registers, control testing, compliance tracking, workflows, and compare tools on usability, scalability, integration, and reporting. While answering, always talk about requirement mapping, tool comparison, integration, and scalability. How do you perform compliance risk assessment for high-risk areas such as AML, bribery, or data privacy? Sample answer. I review processes, red flags, regulatory obligations, historical incidents, and control maturity. I then score risks based on likelihood and impact. While answering, always talk about red flags, obligations, scoring, and control testing. A whistleblower complaint emerges. How do you integrate it into GRC investigations? Sample answer. I record the complaint in the GRC system, assess severity, assign investigators, preserve evidence, and track actions to closure with governance oversight. While answering, always talk about documentation, severity analysis, evidence, and tracking. How do you assess the effectiveness of internal control frameworks like COSO? Sample answer. I test control design, operating effectiveness, documentation quality, and monitoring frequency. I align assessment with COSO components. While answering, always talk about design, effectiveness, documentation, and COSO alignment. A company wants to integrate IT risk with enterprise risk. How do you structure this? Sample answer. I align IT risks with enterprise categories, map controls to frameworks like NIST or ISO, integrate cyber KRIs, and unify reporting dashboards. While answering, always talk about risk alignment, frameworks, KRIs, and unified reporting. How do you test whether controls are operating effectively across different business functions? Sample answer. I perform walkthroughs, sample testing, evidence inspection, and re-performance of controls. I score effectiveness and document deviations. While answering, always talk about walkthroughs, sampling, evidence, and scoring. A company has rapidly expanded. How do you assess governance impact of fast growth? Sample answer. I evaluate whether governance structures, committees, approval matrices, and policies have scaled with business size. I check if decision rights are still clear or now diluted. I analyze people capacity, documentation quality, and whether risk oversight lagged behind expansion. While answering, always talk about scalability, clarity of roles, oversight strength, and documentation readiness. How do you identify emerging risks and integrate them into GRC processes? Sample answer. I scan regulatory updates, industry changes, technology trends, and internal incidents. I categorize emerging risks, assign owners, and embed them into risk registers. I update KRIs and monitoring plans accordingly. While answering, always talk about scanning, categorization, ownership, and monitoring updates. A client wants to implement risk-based compliance monitoring. How do you approach it? Sample answer. I prioritize processes with high regulatory exposure, past issues, and weak controls. I design testing plans weighted by risk severity. Monitoring becomes more dynamic, more intense in high-risk areas. While answering, always talk about prioritization, weighting, control weakness, and dynamic testing. How do you evaluate GRC reporting to senior leadership and the board? Sample answer. I assess whether reports are timely, data-driven, highlight trends, quantify risks, and clearly flag decisions needed. I review dashboards for clarity and completeness. While answering, always talk about timeliness, insight quality, escalation needs, and dashboard clarity. A company has inconsistent compliance documentation. How do you standardize it? Sample answer. I create uniform templates for policies, SOPs, controls, and evidence logs. I introduce version control and archiving rules. I train teams on documentation standards. While answering, always talk about templates, control, versioning, and training. How do you determine KRIs, key risk indicators for critical business processes? Sample answer. I identify risk drivers, define measurable indicators, set thresholds, and align them with risk appetite. KRIs must be predictive, not just reflective. While answering, always talk about drivers, measurability, thresholds, and predictiveness. A client faces increasing cyber incidents. How do you assess cybersecurity governance? Sample answer. I evaluate cyber policies, roles, incident response, board oversight, and alignment with frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001. I assess whether cyber risk integrates into enterprise risk. While answering, always talk about frameworks, oversight, integration, and incident readiness. How do you evaluate vendor and third-party compliance risks? Sample answer. I assess onboarding due diligence, contract clauses, monitoring frequency, SLA compliance, and whether third parties follow corporate policies. While answering, always talk about due diligence, monitoring, clauses, and compliance alignment. A company wants to strengthen its ethical compliance structure. How do you design a code of conduct program? Sample answer. I draft principles, define prohibited behaviors, build reporting channels, design training modules, and assign disciplinary mechanisms. While answering, always talk about principles, reporting, training, and enforcement. How do you check alignment between corporate strategy and enterprise risk management, ERM? Sample answer. I match strategic priorities with relevant risks. Check whether ERM captures these, and verify mitigation plans. I ensure strategic KPIs map to risk indicators. While answering, always talk about mapping, risk alignment, mitigation, and KPIs. A company wants ISO 27001 or 27701 certification. How do you evaluate readiness? Sample answer. I assess current controls against ISO requirements, identify gaps, evaluate documentation maturity, and prepare a remediation roadmap. While answering, always talk about gap analysis, documentation, remediation, and certification readiness. How do you assess maturity of compliance automation and monitoring tools? Sample answer. I evaluate tool coverage, automation depth, workflow usage, integration with other systems, and reporting capabilities. I score maturity from manual to optimized. While answering, always talk about coverage, integration, automation depth, and maturity scoring. A company faces allegations of bribery or corruption. How do you perform compliance investigation? Sample answer. I secure documents, review transactions, analyze gifts and payments, assess policy breaches, and interview involved parties. I report findings objectively. While answering, always talk about evidence, pattern analysis, interviews, and neutrality. How do you evaluate internal audit integration within the broader GRC framework? Sample answer. I check whether internal audit shares risk insights, aligns its plan with ERM, escalates issues effectively, and collaborates without losing independence. While answering, always talk about alignment, escalation, independence, and integration. A business heavily relies on manual controls. How do you assess automation opportunities and GRC benefits? Sample answer. I identify repetitive controls, evaluate automation potential, and estimate risk reduction from less human error. Automated controls also improve evidence retention. While answering, always talk about repeatability, risk reduction, evidence, and scalability. How do you evaluate data governance practices in GRC assessments? Sample answer. I check data ownership, quality controls, lineage documentation, and access governance. I test how data flows into reports used for compliance. While answering, always talk about ownership, quality, lineage, and access. A company has overlapping controls across functions. How do you rationalize them? Sample answer. I map controls to risks, identify duplicates, consolidate similar controls, and redesign leaner control sets. While answering, always talk about mapping, duplication, consolidation, and optimization. How do you validate regulatory compliance in high-risk regulated sectors like BFSI or pharma? Sample answer. I test high-risk processes, review evidence samples, validate control design, and ensure reporting meets regulatory specificity. While answering, always talk about risk focus, sampling, design adequacy, and reporting precision. A compliance breach occurs. How do you assess root cause using GRC principles? Sample answer. I examine process failures, control gaps, human behavior, and systemic weaknesses. I evaluate whether governance oversight was sufficient. While answering, always talk about process gaps, control failures, behavior, and oversight. How do you evaluate alignment between policies, procedures, and actual practices? Sample answer. I compare documented rules with what teams actually do through walkthroughs, interviews, and control testing. I highlight mismatches and risks. While answering, always talk about comparison, walkthroughs, deviations, and risks. How do you conduct a GRC effectiveness assessment for senior management? Sample answer. I evaluate leadership involvement, decision quality, risk responsiveness, and compliance culture. I use scorecards and stakeholder interviews. While answering, always talk about leadership, responsiveness, culture, and scoring. A company wants to improve transparency and reporting. How do you design a GRC dashboard? Sample answer. I define KPIs, KRIs, issue status indicators, and heat maps. Dashboards must be simple, visual, and highlight decisions needed by management. While answering, always talk about KPIs, visualization, heat maps, and decision support. How do you evaluate financial crime compliance frameworks? Sample answer. I assess A&L controls, ABC policies, sanctions screening, investigations process, and governance oversight. I compare maturity to FATF and ISO guidelines. While answering, always talk about controls, screening, investigations, and governance. How do you assess the effectiveness of employee training programs in GRC areas? Sample answer. I evaluate training coverage, frequency, content quality, testing results, and behavioral outcomes. I check whether employees retain and apply concepts. While answering, always talk about coverage, content, testing, and behavior. After finalizing your GRC assessment, how do you summarize and present observations to CXOs and the board? Sample answer. I prepare a concise storyline, key risks, gaps, trends, root causes, and recommended actions. I use heat maps and prioritize issues by severity. I suggest timelines, owners, and governance mechanisms. While answering, always talk about storyline, prioritization, visuals, and actionable recommendations. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.